Hi everyone, welcome to this edition of Crime Time. We've had a really difficult week in terms of hostages being executed and also the burning of the Jordanian pilot, burning him alive, being murdered by the thugs of ISIS. And so today I wanted to really get into what's going on with hostage taking in the Middle East and have back on the show Chris Voss. He is a retired FBI agent and he is also an adjunct professor at the USC Marshall School of Business and CEO of the Black Swan and a negotiating service. But he is also somebody who dealt with hostage negotiations for the FBI. And he was on something that we didn't talk about last time he was on the show, the New York Joint Terrorist Task Force for 14 years. He is uniquely qualified to discuss a lot of the things that I want to talk about today. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about what the FBI teaches in terms of negotiations and what are some key things that you want to be doing when you're negotiating with someone. It's something that I think applies to not only criminals, but it also applies to actual negotiations. But it's something I want you also to keep in mind when you're watching shows on the media and you're watching reporters ask questions and you're trying to ascertain who's telling the truth or what people are saying. So let's get underway here with the murder of the Jordanian pilot Fahad Kasabeh. It was a hideous scenario. We're not going to be showing any of that video and even pictures of him in his imprisonment before he was killed by the ISIS thugs and terrorist organization. Let me just ask you first, the major thing that I was interested in, Chris, and thank you for being on the show, first of all.
Thanks for having me back on. I love being here.
I think that you can help us out a lot in understanding what's going on in the Middle East. First of all, there was a lot of talk, and I think that this has also been posted on the news, and you've heard different reports, that the Jordanians knew that this pilot had been killed while they were in the process of publicly negotiating, asking for proof of life, and that's what we kept hearing. The scenario was that one Japanese journalist was still alive, and the ISIS terrorist had asked for the release of a terrorist involved in suicide bombings of a hotel in Jordan about 10 years ago in exchange for the life of the Japanese man. Instead, the Jordanians said that they wanted the release of their pilot. Anyway, there was a lot of high-profile discussion and comments from the Jordanians, from their actual government, from the Japanese government. Do you think that the Jordanians knew that this pilot was dead when they were negotiating?
Well, there's two issues. First of all, is how do you what is it to know? They didn't have his remains, so absent that, that's absolute confirmation. So what is it to know? And secondly, even if you know, what's the best move anyway? Quite clearly, there was plenty of reason for them to strongly suspect that he was already dead. Not the least of which is they're right there. They've got no shortage of intelligence assets on the ground. There's plenty of talk back and forth. They probably had a lot of indication through their intelligence assets that he'd probably already been killed. The second thing was, once sort of this positioning started between Jordan and ISIS, I thought it was extremely interesting that they had the opportunity to try to provide proof of life of the pilot, which would have provoked many of the people in Jordan who were calling for Jordan to do whatever they could to release him. That would have been to their favor, would have been to their advantage to play that card. Instead, they dragged the Japanese in, and they actually provide proof of life of Goto to his wife in Japan. So they're not above providing proof of life. So their actions continued to show that they didn't have a card to play. Now, the smart move for Jordan while this is going on, because bargaining for hostages has been accepted in the Middle East for thousands of years. It's in their culture. They see it quite differently than we do. It's not that big of a deal to them. So Jordan also needs to let everyone in the region know that they respect their culture, they respect their heritage. They're willing to talk, they're willing to bargain if they're not being lied to publicly. It makes them look much better overall. It's a much smarter move to show that ISIS is lying publicly, and I think they absolutely handled it the right way.
Let's talk a little bit about the history of using hostages and bargaining for hostages and how this has been going on for millions of years, but I know that in the past you've talked a little bit about how this kind of really gained a lot of traction during the Syrian conflict, and that there were hostages taken in the Syrian conflict that were taken by Syrian rebels and then traded to ISIS, and that we have a lot of exchanges going on between the different terrorist groups. So what actually is going on in terms of who's taking hostages? Do we even know who we're going to be negotiating with? I mean, or where these hostages are, if they're being moved from group to group?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it became very confusing in Syria. And as all the borders sort of fell away as the Syrian conflict got worse, and the United States stayed out of it and didn't do anything, then more and more sort of anarchy reigned among the varying groups that were vying for power. They found themselves in a position of holding hostages. From their perspective, it's a commodities business. They don't have to necessarily trade the hostage for money. And I've been hearing from a lot of sources, and I knew from people that were in a position to know, that hostages were being traded for all sorts of things. They were being traded for weapons, they were being traded for political favors, they were being traded for other hostages. In the region, that's not that unusual for groups to trade, and there's often a secondary market for hostages where they're being traded for something besides money. So that was going on in Syria, and that's the market. That's the way they do business.
So what happened here with the Jordanians? I mean, if they had a hostage that was this important to the Jordanian government and to its people, it doesn't make much sense, like what they did. And I wondered if you could sort of break it down and explain to me what's happened here and what you think the after effects are going to be.
Well, I think this is the one really wrong move that ISIS has made. The condemnation in the Arab world for this action is strong and across the board. And if there's anything that is uniting the Arab world against ISIS, it's this particular act. Not only did they appear to burn someone alive, but they did it to an Arab, and they did it to a Muslim. So this was wrong in every sense of the word. The sheikh, the chief sheikh, the head sheikh at Al-Azhar Mosque, which is affiliated with Al-Azhar University in Cairo, has come out very strongly against this. And this is a leading voice in the Islamic world. It's important to pay attention to how significant it is that they have condemned this action. And in no small terms. I mean, he's basically sanctioned medieval punishments for these people, and it's fairly unusual for them to come out that strongly. So the way this happened, I think it's quite possible that the Jordanian pilot was killed accidentally early on, and they didn't know what to do. They wanted to try to still have a commodity, get value for something they didn't have. Interestingly enough, a great way to cover up what really happened to him is to appear to have burned him. I'm not entirely sure that they actually burned him. Notice it's being reported that the video also shows that they take a bulldozer in and supposedly smash the entire area. If you're looking to cover up evidence of what actually happened, this is a great way to do it. They just happen to have gone too far in destroying the evidence of what actually happened. There's been a couple of discussions of how unstable the ISIS people are on the ground and how unpredictable they are. Many people in the media say, oh, the ISIS fighters are completely unpredictable on the ground. Well, there's a difference between how unpredictable the unstable types on the ground are and how predictable the people that are in charge of ISIS are. The people that are behind ISIS are fairly predictable. They continue to act in the same manner. If they do any change, it's simply to escalate what they're doing. I think there's a pretty good chance that the Jordanian fighter may have actually been killed accidentally before ISIS knew what they wanted to do with him. Now they're left in a position, how do we exert maximum value, still get maximum press attention out of this, which certainly, even though this looks like it was a bad move that finally backfired on them, no shortage of attention in the world's media to them having done this.
You know, I know, but do you mean that it was edited, or they burned somebody else alive, or are you commenting on the slickness of the production? I haven't watched it, and I don't have any plans to. But from the description that I've heard from reporters about what happened, they say that it looked a certain way. And so, are you saying that they just sort of edited it and made it look like a film and did what they had to do?
I think they're absolutely capable of doing that. Okay. I'm not sure if that's what they did. They have shown tremendous media sophistication. Every single video they put out has been heavily edited anyway. There's some question as to whether or not the backgrounds in the films are actually there, that they were shot inside a building which essentially was a makeshift studio of their own. They put the backgrounds up in the back. So they're certainly capable of having edited a video like this. And it's possible, what I actually saw before I heard descriptions of the video, my guess was that they had taken his body and they burned his body because they still had to cover up whatever happened to him. And this is a great way to cover all that up.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't heard anybody talk about that at all, like that it possibly hadn't happened. But I guess at this point it kind of serves the coalition's purposes, since there is such a strong reaction from Jordan for everybody to be united now, that nobody really wants to question whether or not, because it seems that this act has brought some unity in Jordan. And that I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because this is an area that you understand. I mean, how much of an ally is Jordan, or was Jordan, before this event? And were they really supporting the coalition and sending planes and just doing it quietly? Have we seen that much of a change today? Because there were reports that they accompanied U.S. airplanes on these strikes on ISIS areas that ISIS is holding. And it was my understanding they were doing that already. So I'm wondering, with all the rhetoric, did anything really change?
I think it's really hard for Americans to appreciate how difficult it is for Arab nations to join us side by side in the region. It's really hard for them to do. So any nation, any Arab nation that does that and is openly seen as being on our side is a tremendous step. They are tremendous friends. It's a very difficult thing for them to do, because they're standing alongside someone that in the Arab world backs Israel, and that's really hard for them. It's extremely hard. That's a very unsettled issue, and it's hard for any Arab nation to stand next to us. And a number of them do. The Jordanians are standing next to us. The Emiratis stand next to us very solidly. They have for a very long time.
Well, what about today's reports about the Emirates, that they are backing off of flying any missions because they're concerned about our search and rescue, and that we didn't have anybody close enough to get the Jordanian pilot? And there have been reports that we've moved forces into northern Iraq. So what do you think, that they're going to stand strong still? Or, I mean, there was some wavering today. There were reports about it, and I'm just curious.
The Emiratis are our friends.
Okay.
They may well be the best friend we have in a region, certainly the best Arab friend that we have in a region. They are tremendously supportive, as much as they can be. They also realize that they represent a great deal in that area. For all intents and purposes, the entire Arab world, everyone in the Arab world is going into the UAE to do business. Good guys and bad guys. Okay. And they respect the UAE while this is going on. So us understanding the delicate position that the UAE is in through all of this is really important. And it's why we're careful about what we say about them in the media, because the secondary consequences of something said the wrong way can be significant.
Okay, so when we're listening to, and I guess when everybody at home is listening to reports about who's for us or who's against us in that region, I guess, are we supposed to take it all with a grain of salt, because we don't really know what's actually happening behind closed doors, since there's so much pressure on them publicly? I mean, when I hear these announcements that Morocco is backing off of taking active participation in the coalition, do we not really know what's actually happening, because everybody's making statements that are geared to show that they're not our friend? I mean, right. For a different audience.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of put everybody in one firm black and white camp when there's nothing but gray. I mean, and there really isn't any black and white there, especially when we continue to be very close with Israel, our good friend Israel. We continue to support Israel for good reasons. So I'm not criticizing that. But we have very good friends that are Arabs and Arab nations that have a problem with Israel at the same time. And they have to continue to calculate all of those things for what happens to them in the region, because they have to deal with each other as well. And there's no shortage of issues that they're trying to deal with each other on.
Now, I was curious about what your thoughts are. We talked a little bit about, in the last show, about the Americans and our negotiation tactics, but we didn't really get into specifics about what the president says or what the president didn't say in the negotiation issues with James Foley and Stephen Sotloff. And I was wondering, if basically here are some of the statistics that in a New York Times investigation, that they found that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates brought in at least $125 million through ransom payments since 2008, 66 million in 2013. Money came largely for European governments. We talked that a lot of the ISIS funding, much of it is coming from extortion and multiple kidnappings for ransom. So I'm wondering, the Japanese, when they were negotiating to try to get Kenji Goto back and Haruno Yokawa back, his friend, Kenji Goto apparently went in to try to save his friend who was already kidnapped. The Japanese government made a number of public statements. They said the situation is deadlocked. This is before the killing of Mr. Goto. The foreign minister said in Tokyo on Saturday that the situation was unpredictable. Anything could happen. We can't predict it at all. We're preparing for every situation. He said, I want to make every effort for Mr. Goto's release. We knew that the Japanese were under extreme pressure, but now we're hearing that they didn't really have the connections, even though you said they've paid out a huge amount of money for hostages. They're known as being big payers for hostages in the region. Did the Japanese handle the situation with their two hostages well? I mean, or did things kind of careen out of control when they got involved with the Jordanians and the Jordanian pilot? I'm wondering what you thought on the sidelines watching the statements that were being made by the Japanese government.
Well, the statements that are being made by any given government and how well they're handling it are not always exactly the same thing. A lot of politicians, government officials, unless they've handled a bunch of kidnappings, don't understand how damaging the things that they could say in the media are going to be, because they want to speak to the people in their country, when in fact the smart thing to do is have an understanding of how the people that are the adversaries or the neutral observers are going to see it. A phrase that we've always loved is the most dangerous negotiation is the one you don't know you're in. When you're making media statements, it is a negotiation. ISIS has begun the negotiation in every instance as soon as they've gone into the media. And by and large, the world's governments have not understood what negotiation they were in while they were in that. If there's a head of government like in Japan, if they're not used to this, if they're not getting advice, understanding that this is the game that they're playing, they often say things that aren't that helpful. That doesn't necessarily mean that what they're doing behind the scenes is bad. Behind the scenes, it's not that complicated. You find the intermediaries that are in a position to handle the negotiations, and then you proceed in the negotiations. The problem then becomes when ISIS throws the Jordanian pilot into the middle of this, there's probably no shortage of intelligence made available to the Japanese that ISIS is trying to negotiate with something they don't have. Oh. That's not a good sign for the Japanese, because then their first thought is, well, how do we save our people? How do we protect our citizens when we're dealing with someone who's clearly lying to the entire world at this point in time? What kind of negotiation are we in now? So from what I've seen publicly, I think the Japanese did just fine. I think they did as well as they could have.
It just sort of careened away from them, it seems. I mean, with the issue of the pilot.
Or if it was ever that close to them at all.
I see.
That assumes that at one point in time, it was close to them and they had some ability to influence it. They may never have had any ability to influence it.
Now, you've talked also about the government and their response to videos, and I was wondering, if you actually talked about the Bergdahl negotiation, which has become a real hot-button issue here in the United States. I mean, probably also around the world, that Bo Bergdahl deserted his post, and why did we negotiate to get him back? And the government, our government, said basically that he was in poor health, they feared for his life, and that since we were leaving Iraq and our troops were leaving Iraq, we didn't want to leave anybody behind, and that's sort of what we always do. It was a prisoner exchange, not a negotiation for hostage, and that it sort of sums up. But Obama has said things in reaction to videos as well, and he said, and as a response, I mean, we've heard from ISIS when Mr. Foley was being held, the life of this American citizen, Obama, depends on your next decision. And he addressed that video in a press conference, although he didn't reveal too much. I'm just wondering how you think Obama has done in terms of responding to these videos. Now he's on a thing where he calls them barbarous. I mean, barbarians.
Which
yeah,
is not the right term.
Which you said had objected to. He said it again when he heard about the Jordanian pilot. And I'm wondering, is he responding incorrectly? Would you advise him to take a different course? We saw his response to the Jordanian pilot. We saw his response to ISIS's demand when they held Foley and they held Mr. Sotloff. What do you think of how he's been responding?
I think the failure is in his advisors. I think his advisors are failing him. I think they're putting him in a position. If you're the president of the United States, your advisors have to not let you say things that aren't that good. I mean, I think his advisors have been utterly failing him. And it's difficult to sort of push the proper advice up through the channels. And it wasn't always easy for us when we did it as well. During the Bush administration, Bush 43, there was a period of time when they were calling the terrorist barbarians as well. And fortunately, at that point in time, I had somebody, was working with somebody at the National Security Council, a captain from the Coast Guard named Dane Egley, who was an extremely hardworking guy. He was very smart, and he wasn't afraid of making people angry. And he started to write and push and write and push and write and push. It took him quite a while, but we finally got the Bush administration to stop calling terrorists barbarians and refer to them as what they are, which is cowards and criminals. So it takes a lot of work to push that up to the White House through the National Security Council, and it presupposes that there are people there that know what they're doing. And they have to have dealt with a number of kidnappings in a row before they finally catch on. So the way they reacted to this and the Bergdahl negotiation, and most of it, is a bunch of people who are very new to the game and think because they're very smart, they could play this game. And they've found out in about the last year that they haven't. I've been hearing back channel through reporters in Washington, D.C. and a number of other sources that they finally discovered the policy they always had, and they've discovered the nuances that are in it, and said, yeah, well, with the nuance, yes, we can handle it like this. So they're catching on, but it takes a while to catch on. And if you haven't been confronted with this sort of a crisis in a while, and the Obama administration has been ignoring kidnapping because it hasn't been Americans that have been taken in Syria, or Al-Qaeda in Northern Africa, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which has been funding Al-Qaeda around the world through kidnapping. They haven't been grabbing Americans. So it hasn't been a hot button issue for the White House. It's barely been a back button issue. Suddenly Americans are getting grabbed, they're new to it, and they're a little overwhelmed by it.
Okay. Let me ask you this. I mean, as we look at sort of the world situation here, is there a difference in how we deal with hostage takers, say in Africa or Somalia, as opposed to what we're dealing with in the Middle East? Is there a policy? Do you think it behooves the Americans and the government to have a policy where they're not insisting we don't negotiate with terrorists, that they have some sort of consistent policy? Or is each part of the world so different that they shouldn't have any kind of consistent policy? Well,
the policy that's there is a really good policy. And they just forget it's there, unfortunately. And sometimes it helps to give them the words to use. And I get so tired of having people in upper levels of the State Department and National Security Council say, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And finally I looked at them and said, we don't negotiate with them, we negotiate against them. And then they went, oh, interesting. So it depends upon your view of negotiation. Most politicians practice negotiation as compromise and giving things up. Politicians are known as great compromisers. I'll give this, you give that. Well, that's a bad idea in dealing with terrorists. You can't compromise. You shouldn't make concessions. So when negotiation equates to, in their world, they think negotiation is compromise and giving things up, then they're afraid of it. But when you just look at it as a completely different point of view, and maybe you look at it as an offensive weapon, and the best hard bargainers look at negotiation as a very offensive weapon, a way to get what you want without giving anything up, which is essentially a hostage negotiator's job.
Well, let's take a look at that, because you actually do teach negotiation over at USC at the business school. Chris Voss teaches as an adjunct professor, as I said at the top of the show, and that there are certain techniques that he teaches in terms of negotiation that maybe we should be either using in our own life, using when we watch reports about issues involving hostages, looking at when we look at any kind of negotiation, particularly among politicians as well. But let me ask you, let's start off. You said there are 6 techniques that the FBI hostage negotiation professionals use to take their negotiations to the next level. And one of them is asking open-ended questions. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, well, an open-ended question, and it's a great technique that works with about 2/3 of the people that are out there, is a way to take great advantage of the idea. The secret to gaining the upper hand in a negotiation is to give the other side the illusion of control. If I ask a proper open-ended question, I can really sort of frame it very narrowly, and you'll never feel that. If I want to confront you about something that you've done that I didn't like, I did this once with a supervisor I was working for. I said to him, when you originally approved this, what did you have in mind? Which was a subtle way of telling him at one point in time he saw things my way. And now he seemed to be backtracking. But since I put it to him like that, and what he was really after was a feeling of control with me, because there were times when I didn't exactly do what I was told.
I find that easy to believe, yeah.
Which was sort of my trademark.
Yeah.
Disregarding what people above me said to do, in lieu of what I thought was right, which was always my guiding principle. But he needed to feel like he was in control. And I remember when he said that, because he actually was going to take away his approval for the first time I went to train with people at Harvard Law School on a Harvard negotiation project, which he had already approved, but I had made him mad a few days earlier and he was going to withdraw the approval. So I asked him that open-ended question, and he looked at me and he sat back, and I could tell he felt very in charge, which is what I wanted. And then he approved the trip. So giving the other side the feeling that they're in charge is often what an open-ended question does. It gives you the chance to tell me things, to enlighten me. And there's great power from me in empowering you in that fashion. And you like it, and you'll probably talk to me, and we'll find our way to you giving you the opportunity to give me what I want.
Okay, so there's also effective pauses, and so let's sort of go through that, how that works, and minimal encouragers. I'll ask those two things. The effective pauses, pausing, the power of pausing.
Right. Well, some people, and it's often a control issue, well, are horrified at being silent. I mean, horrified. I was coaching an attorney one time in some negotiations, very assertive female attorney, and talk, because she felt that she needed to make her argument. And as long as she was talking, she was in charge. And if she was talking, the other side wasn't making their argument. She was trying to overwhelm them. And I remember saying to her once, did it ever occur to you to not talk?
Okay.
And she went silent. And then to her credit, she said, no. And then I said, well, oftentimes if you go silent after you've said something really important, then you keep them on the hook. And when you said something really important and follow it up immediately with something else, you just let them off the hook. So the right open-ended question, or maybe the right observation, leave them on the hook. Let them break the silence. There's a really good chance they're going to say something you could use.
Okay, and minimal encouragers.
Minimal encouragers, unfortunately, is pretty much what everybody does all the time while they're multitasking. And it's saying, yeah, okay, I'm listening, go on. Now, it's in the broader context, it's a very important tool, but not if that's the only thing that you do. So it's very effective when, and you're actually doing a great job of using minimal encouragers with me right now while we're talking, you're doing it physically. So you can give people minimal encouragers by nodding your head if they can see you, or if they can't see you and they have a lot to get off of their chest, then you occasionally, yeah, okay. Let them know you're there and that you're processing and you're still being present. The other side really likes it, which is why so many people do it, but that's their only skill, because it's a great way to keep the other person talking when you're not paying attention.
Yeah, but I think at minimal encouragers that are insincere would sort of register that way.
They do, and the other side gets annoyed.
Right.
So that's absolutely correct.
Well, I mean, I've seen it when I'm asking someone. I'm going to stop for just a second because I wanted to get to something else, and we're sort of running low on time. But I wanted to talk to you about the 9/11 hijacker who has been making statements. He was convicted of assisting in. He was the unknown hijacker. Actually, he was the last hijacker, and he had been convicted of being part of that plot to bomb the World Trade Center, and he never got on his plane as he was supposed to. And for those of you who know, he's now currently in prison serving his sentence. He has alleged that Saudi Arabia helped, and a government-affiliated charity, knowingly provided funding and other material support to Al-Qaeda to help carry out those attacks. Of course, Moussaoui has gotten a lot of trashing from the Saudis. In Washington, the Saudi embassy said on Wednesday, that's yesterday, that Moussaoui's claims appeared aimed at undermining Saudi-U.S. relations and contradicted findings of the 9/11 Commission in 2004 that there was no evidence of Saudi funding of al-Qaeda. Now, there's pages missing or blacked out or redacted in the report from the 9/11 Commission, stuff that was supposed to be classified, so everybody's wondering if maybe that's where the Saudi funding is. But I'm curious, they've dismissed him as a crazy person, and it's pretty easy to do with somebody rotting away in jail and who's already a villain and an enemy of the government, of the United States government for the Saudis. Meanwhile, the Saudis are being sued by victims of the 9/11 tragedies, the families of the victims. So I'm curious, do you put any store in anything this guy's saying?
No, not really. Because there appears to be some sort of connection someplace. First of all, al-Qaeda is a threat in Saudi also. They're a threat to every Arab country. I actually helped train some hostage negotiators getting back to the UAE, and I trained hostage negotiators in the UAE, and when I sat down with them, they said, all right, so we're worried about violent attacks from two groups. We're worried about Iran, and we're worried about al-Qaeda. So all the Arab nations are worried about al-Qaeda also. So it would be ridiculous to think that there wouldn't be elements within the Saudi government that's trying to keep track of al-Qaeda, the same way that the FBI tries to keep track of all the organized crime threats here. And at different points in time, we try to recruit informants, and we pay informants. So we don't know how that, did money come from someplace in the Saudi government to someone in al-Qaeda? More than likely. But why did it happen? Was it because the Saudi government supported al-Qaeda? No, they're a threat. There was an al-Qaeda group in Saudi in 2004 that were killing Saudis right and left, and it was al-Qaeda. They had to have intelligence, they had to gather intelligence on these people. So to say that money changed hands at some point in time and is more than likely, I'd be disappointed in them if it didn't. I'd want to know why that money changed hands, and I'd want to know a lot more about it. And that's why you can fool people quite easily by saying that some group supported another group simply because money changed hands between the two groups.
What did you think when you saw Michael Moore's allegations about this? Because you were working with the anti-terrorism task force in New York City. I mean, you've been very involved in the investigation of the 1993 bombing attack on the World Trade Center. And so I'm just curious, and I wanted the audience to understand why I'm asking Chris these questions. What did you think about Fahrenheit 9/11? Was it very wrong about a lot of things involving about the Saudis' involvement?
Well, he's trying to boil things down into cliches, and he's trying to sensationalize. And so he'll take something and reinterpret it in another way. I know because I worked the kidnapping of an American in Saudi in 2004, and the group that had kidnapped that American, Paul Johnson, and murdered him at that time, had been killing Saudis. So to say that the Saudi royal family supported the violence of a group that was killing Saudis is naive, and it's a misrepresentation and an oversimplification. Al-Qaeda killed Saudis, and the Saudi government was doing everything it can to stop them from doing that. So to say that the Saudi government supported them is ridiculous.
Okay. Do you think the same thing is true? I mean, I have to ask this question, and it's a bit of a non sequitur, but we're looking at American Sniper now that's supposed to adequately reflect what was going on in Iraq and how the United States Army was functioning there, and it's a very patriotic bent and sort of a movie that makes us sort of feel very good about, in some ways, what we did there, and good about our soldiers and our armed forces. And I'm curious, do you think that that is an accurate reflection? I mean, I think that when we look at films and media about the war, I'm wondering what your take is on that one.
Well, first of all, we should be proud of what our soldiers did in Iraq, and we should still be proud of them. That was a mess then, and it's a mess now. And it hasn't gone away. And for regular, just average Joe on the street human beings to get thrown into the middle of that in a very confusing situation where the politics are not clear, and ask them to start first defending themselves from all these different groups that are trying to kill them. And then to support what the American policy is there is a complicated thing. There's a reason they say war is hell. It destroys people's lives. Traumatic stress is vicious. Very few veterans come back from a war zone without it having scarred them psychologically in some way. So I'm happy to see a film that reminds us that our soldiers are human beings. And the other difficult part that's going on in this country right now is this is one of the few times that we've been involved in a war this long overseas where we don't feel it. This is not World War II when we were giving stuff up domestically to support the war effort. This war has been going on since 9/11, 14 years, and we go on about our lives here. Pretty much the war is only something that's in the news or the occasional movie. You know, we don't really feel it ourselves unless there's a member of our family that comes back and we see how wrecked the experience has been for them. So I'm happy that American Sniper came out and reminded us that our soldiers are human beings, and no matter what our government's policy is, whether we feel rightly or wrongly about it, Joe and his street average guys get thrown into the middle of it and they get asked to survive psychologically, and it's not that easy of a thing to do.
Okay. Well, I had a couple other that I just wanted to finish off on the hostage negotiation because we went through 3 of them, but we also have, in terms of hostage negotiating, just even though we're towards the end of the show, I wanted to hit mirroring and paraphrasing, those 2 different techniques. So what is mirroring?
What is mirroring?
Yeah. You're repeating the last phrase, right?
I love
I think that
mirroring.
one sounds annoying.
Well, it depends upon how you work it in. I mean, it's a great skill. It's a good thing for keeping people talking. I happen to be the type of person that mirroring works on very well. The people in my company do it to me all the time. They think it's very funny because most of the time I don't notice it. And it's a very effective skill. It helps the other person think. And great. And what it does is it also helps them reword things, because most of the time, if I say something to someone and they say, "What do you mean by that?" I repeat it again with the exact same words, only louder, just like an American overseas trying to get English understood. Right. And when someone is stuck in that mind frame, when they think that the words that they've chosen are so perfect, then how could you possibly misunderstand? A mirror is a great way to get them to sort of flip a switch in their mind, think of some other words, and explain it and expand on it again. It's as close to a Jedi mind trick as there is, and it works really, really well. The other
one is paraphrasing.
Paraphrasing is a very similar thing. It takes a little bit longer, and it's just paraphrasing. Once people get used to you paraphrasing with them, they love it. They absolutely love it, because you have to interrupt someone to paraphrase, to reword what they've just said in your own words. And people are used to being interrupted and losing the conversation. So when you interrupt them to paraphrase and give it right back to them, while it initially sort of startles them, after a while they can't get enough of it. They like being listened to, and they like knowing that you're paying attention. It's a really, really effective
Okay,
skill.
so, and the last one we have here is emotional labeling in terms of negotiation technique.
Right, and you know what, that's the one that we've gotten the most mileage out of in the business school. And because, thank God, finally, we're recognizing in business that the real key to business is emotional intelligence. Emotions used to be a dirty word in business. You couldn't be an emotional decision maker. You could be a passionate decision maker, but you couldn't be an emotional decision maker. Emotional intelligence has been put squarely on the map now, so we just call it labels, because we label people's passions, dynamics, their actions. We label a lot of stuff. You know, it seems like there's nothing I can say to get you to make this deal. Is a classic label that one of the students in my MBA class used to cut a phenomenal deal on a real estate negotiation, because he was at a complete impasse, and every single suggestion he had, the owner of the property shot down. And finally, just out of frustration, because I taught him how to label other dynamics in the deal, he just looked at him and said, "It seems like there's nothing I can say to get you to make this deal." And the owner of the property said, "No, as a matter of fact, here's what I want," and laid it out, and they cut the deal. Mm-hmm. So we've taken what used to be known strictly as a crisis intervention technique or a hostage negotiation technique, and we put it in the business world. And students in my classes, you know, who are mid-level rising star executives, mm-hmm. if you're working on an MBA at night while you're working full-time, you're a sharp, hard-working person. And these are the people that are in my classes at USC and also still at Georgetown University. And they are they're killing it with these. I mean, they're making phenomenal deals.
Well, they're good things to know, and it gives you a little insight into what kind of techniques are used in negotiations for the FBI. I want to thank you, Chris, for being here. We ran a little bit over, but I was kind of interested in hearing it, and there's been so much news going on, so thank you for coming today. Thank you guys for watching, and comment and let us know what you're thinking about what we discussed today, because we took a really inside look at what's going on in a hostage negotiation and the hostage troubles and executions and horrible things that have happened in the Middle East with citizens from a lot of the countries that are involved in the coalition. And we'll keep you apprised and keep analyzing it. And we'll see you next time on Crime Time.